You're listening to the Unwritable Rant podcast with your host, author, and occasional misanthrope, Juliette Miranda. Go to theunwritablerant.com and you can subscribe on iTunes or connect with the show on Facebook and Twitter.
Hey there, y'all. It's Juliette Miranda. Welcome to episode number 89 of the Unwritable Rant podcast. Glasses up, y'all. It's time for a toast. Put something delicious in that glass, raise it up, and let's say cheers. Oh, hello, bourbon. Today I'm drinking something new. It's called Bib and Tucker, and it is a 6-year aged bourbon. The mash bill is 70% corn, 26% rye, and 4% malted barley. And I have to say I'm a little bit surprised by this bourbon. For a drink that's been aged 6 years, it doesn't have the taste of an aged bourbon. If I hadn't read that, I would have assumed this was much younger. It has a very, very light mouthfeel. And it's a little conflicting. Here's what I like about the bourbon. Right up front, it tastes like summer. It has this tremendously grassy sort of flavor. It's just very earthy, which I love. But then oddly, it's unbalanced because at the back end, I get this sort of licorice flavor, and I'm finding it a little bit disconcerting right now. That's not to say this is a bad bourbon by any stretch, it's just different. At the very least, the bottle is tremendously gorgeous. It's etched and dark and just very pretty, and it's going to look beautiful on my bar. But it is going to take me a little bit of getting used to, so I'd better start now. Y'all, I am excited to say that it is officially the start of festival season. I am so looking forward to hitting the road with my guy. We're going to be indulging in fried fair food, watching pig races, and checking out some of our very favorite bands this summer. I will say that one of the downside to festivals is that they lack some of the luxuries my guy and I prefer. Because as much as I love sunshine and warm summer nights, I'm not a girl who's very good at roughing it. I'll tell you, I get twitchy if I sit too long on grass. And call me crazy, but I like quality toilet paper and not having to wait in line to pee. And obviously, as I'm sure you all have figured out by now, I will always choose a lovely mixed cocktail over a sweaty bottle of beer. So whenever possible, my guy and I will splurge on special ticket packages. Or we'll reach out to the sponsors that we know so that we can gain access to the elusive festival VIP area. But when those resources are not available to us, well, we're forced to get a little bit more creative in escaping the festival crowds. A few summers ago, he and I were at a very large outdoor festival in the Midwest. There were different bands playing nearly every hour across the fairgrounds, ranging from local acts to national touring bands. Every food you could possibly want was deep-fried and available on a stick. And as is customary at these things, beer is the drink of choice and flasks are not permitted. Fortunately, my guy and I managed to stumble across a small tent deep within the fest. They were serving pre-mixed cocktails. Margaritas, Mai Tais, Long Island iced teas. They were all available for the drinking, and oh, did we ever indulge. Over the course of 3 or 4 hours, he and I double-fisted our way through enough Long Island iced teas to overflow Lake Michigan. We'd done our best to try and balance the booze, by having food and the occasional bottle of water. But there is only so much that chocolate-covered bacon and cheese curds can do to combat loaded drinks like those. My guy knew we'd hit kind of a wall when I started seriously contemplating getting a fair tattoo, which is easily the lowest form of tattoo art there is. So he looks at me and says, "Baby, we need to take a break." And if you are anything of a marathon drinker, you know this point that I'm talking about. It is a crucial point. Catch it in time, and you can reboot your system and have enough energy to make it through the rest of the day and night. But if you miss it, or worse, ignore this point, you will wind up passed out under a tree somewhere, covered in spilled beer and bird crap. A cautionary tale for drinkers everywhere. And y'all, that is not me. So we tried to think about what we wanted to do. We could catch a cab and head back to our hotel, but that would be an hour-long process, and neither one of us were quite ready to make that commitment. We didn't want to leave. We just needed to get away from the crowds and spend some quality time in air conditioning. And in thinking about it, we realized that there was only one place in the entire fair where we could do that: the VIP section. It appeared before us like a mirage in the desert. A roped-off arena with couches and cooling tents, access to indoor plumbing, and rows of tables covered with catering. There were icy-looking bowls of pasta salad, crisp lettuce, grilled chicken. It was clearly heaven. And we were clearly on the outskirts of hell. But my guy is nothing if not wildly resourceful when it comes to getting what he wants. He is, of course, the same guy who had, earlier in the day, pounded on the door of a dirty trailer and asked a man wearing nothing but overalls if I could pet one of his racing pigs. So I knew he would have absolutely no problem figuring out a way to get us into the promised land. Our first course of action was to make ourselves look presentable. This was no easy task, considering the toll 4 hours of drinking in the 90-degree sunshine on dirty fairgrounds had taken on our bodies. Quite honestly, it would take a fire hose to make me feel clean after all that, but I did my best. Then, my guy consulted the festival program. His goal? Find the most recognizable non-headlining band with the least recognizable members. After we chewed on a couple of breath mints, we marched right up to the VIP entrance and didn't even pause as we walked in. We expected to be stopped, but the key to these kinds of sneaky endeavors is to be confident but humble. He says, "Hi, I'm Brian, the drummer of REO Speedwagon." He shook the kid's hand and offered him a plausible but hard-to-follow story about forgetting his pass in his gear bag, but needing to grab a bite to eat before playing later that night. The kid was so starstruck that he let us right in. The beauty of festivals like this is that the tents outside of the main arena are usually staffed by locals, people who could care less about who gets in and snags a few free chicken wings. As for my guy impersonating the drummer of REO Speedwagon, tell me this, do you know what he looks like? We settled ourselves right into that VIP section without another word, propping ourselves up on cushions and nodding at people as if it actually mattered who we were. Everything just felt better in there. The water was colder and more refreshing. Booze flowed from the bottle, not a sticky-looking, bacteria-ridden dispenser. The food didn't come with a fine misting of attitude and sweat. And God help me, it had to have been a good 10 degrees cooler in there, thanks to some miraculous breeze I can only assume someone had purchased from Mother Nature. For 1 solid hour, we felt like royalty and acted like Caligula. But that all came to a screeching halt when my guy was approached by a very official-looking man with a walkie-talkie and a clipboard. And you know it had to be bad news because nothing good ever comes from a guy who's carrying a walkie-talkie. He presses the call button on the walkie-talkie and says, "I found him." So we look up at the guy, doing our very best to appear sober. It turns out word had gotten around that the drummer of REO Speedwagon was kicking it in the VIP tent, and this guy was sent to collect him. "Brian, we've been looking all over for you," he says. "We're way behind schedule and need you to do your line check right now." Well, my guy and I both freeze. Panic is setting in. And I have to ask you, what would you do in a situation like this? Would you admit the truth? Would you maybe giggle and say, "Gotcha, I'm really the bass player for Night Ranger"? We really wanted to avoid a scene. So our only option was to stand up and follow the guy out of the tent quietly. And I'll tell you, it felt like we were being led on our own funeral procession. So I'm freaking out, and I look at my guy, and he's completely calm, unwavering, walking tall, proud, and I'm looking at him thinking, holy crap, he's really going to do this. He's going to walk into the arena, step out on stage, and hammer out a half-assed rendition of Can't Fight This Feeling and immediately get us called out. And what would happen then? I'm trying desperately to find a way out of this situation. So I catch my guy's eyes as Mr. Walkie-Talkie is leading us across the fairgrounds. He just smiles, winks, and grabs my hand, and I realize it was silly to worry. Of course my guy has a plan. He always has a plan. And what do you know? Next thing he does He yanks me into the poultry pavilion, where we are quickly absorbed into a crowd of farmers and chickens and geese, effectively leaving that poor walkie-talkie guy to ask the question repeated by countless soundmen, roadies, tour managers, and band members everywhere, just where the hell did the damn drummer go now? And with that, I'm going to have a little bit more bourbon. Hang on, y'all. Bourbon. You know, the more I drink this Bibb & Tucker bourbon, the more it's growing on me. I think this is a bourbon that you have to sip more than a couple of times just to really start to appreciate. So coming off of that story and some of my earlier podcasts, if you've heard them, you might get the impression that I enjoy picking on drummers. And you'd be absolutely right. I do. Don't get me wrong. There are plenty of genuinely talented, personable, kind, amazing drummers in this world. I've just only met a handful of them. The sad reality is that the majority of drummers I've had the misfortune of encountering were all unpleasant, relentless dickbags. Like the closer, a drummer I was forced to spend 3 excruciating days with while I was following a popular female vocalist on the road. It was, at the time, a dream assignment for me. To be completely honest, I wasn't exactly a fan of her music. Like, at all. 90s music to this day just sounds absolutely wretched to me. And she falls distinctly in that sound. But she was ridiculously popular and I was friendly with her publicist. So when I pitched a day-in-the-life style article to a regional publication, they bought it. My assignment was to spend 3 days on the road with her and her band, following them from gigs in Madison to Milwaukee to Chicago. Transportation and lodging and food were all up to me, but the freelance project came with 2 massive perks for a burgeoning music writer: a sizable paycheck and the mother of all backstage passes. Back then, there was something of a hierarchy to backstage access, and I'm guessing there still is today. The lowest rung of access was a walk-in. This was usually reserved for band members and tour managers who would grab a gaggle of girls and lead them into some dark corner of the backstage area, or maybe the tour bus for a quickie. And of course, they would leave them to walk out on their own, alone. Following that is the notorious guest list. If you were lucky, being on the list meant receiving an envelope with a show ticket or a photo pass, or very rarely, a meet and greet pass. The guest list was always, without exception, guarded heavily by a burly guy whose sole power was granting access behind a single closed door. And if you've ever seen the movie Almost Famous, you know just how resounding the words, "not on the list," are. I cannot tell you how many times I have had to argue with some Neanderthal to allow me entrance into some shitty club to see some marginally decent band so that I could write a soul-sucking review in a small magazine only to make a lousy $20. I'd give him my name, he'd take a quick glance, and then bark out, "not on the list." All because some stupid tour manager had misspelled Miranda with an A instead of an I. Then there's the meet and greet pass, which, believe me, is not nearly as coveted as you would think. This little stick-on patch only allows access to a single room, and that single room is populated by the 30 or so other people who'd managed to con one of those passes out of the record label or some connection that they had. The only time you would see a band member at a meet and greet was if one accidentally wandered in looking for the catering spread. But this time, it would all be different. This time, I had my own all-access laminate pass on a lanyard. And that meant I may as well be in the band for all of the places it allowed me to go. The idea was that I would see 3 days worth of touring through the singer's eyes. I'd attend rehearsals, watch the sound check, listen in on interviews, and find out, how she spent her free time. Who was she behind the music? So I met up with her and the band in Madison. And thankfully, I was able to get my main interview with her out of the way right up front. And I will say this, although her music has never been to my taste, she was an absolute sweetheart. Just open and honest. And she really treated the interview seriously, which is more than I can say for a lot of the hair bands I worked with. After the interview, she asked me about my plans for the next 3 days. I figure she just wants to make sure I'm not sort of nutbag expose artist looking for a good headline, so I do my best to explain that I have every intention of respecting her privacy and being unobtrusive. Well, it turns out that wasn't exactly her concern. Instead, she wants to make sure that I have my own hotel rooms booked, which seems like an odd thing for her to be concerned about. So I kind of look at her oddly, and she says, "Listen, I probably shouldn't say anything, you being a writer and all, but I just feel the need to warn you." And I'm thinking, oh, hello, story. So she says, "My drummer, he kind of considers himself a ladies' man. You might want to try to avoid him." I appreciated her concern. I did. But I immediately brushed it off. I mean, come on. It wasn't the 80s anymore. And no offense to her, but her band was definitely not Motley Crue. And this guy wasn't even an actual band member. He was just a hired gun that had been brought in to replace her studio drummer for the tour. So I thank her very politely and I say, "Really, I appreciate it, but I'm not planning on interviewing him anyway." She looks relieved, but follows it up with, "Just watch out for him. He can be a bit persistent." Well, so noted. I can't say I really took her warning all that seriously, and I pretty much forgot all about that big bad drummer until soundcheck. I was wandering around the auditorium, trying to pretend I understood everything that was going on, nodding my head like I could tell the difference between the low end from one side of the room to the other. But then I heard my name called out over the PA. "Oh, Juliette, Juliette, wherefore art thou Romeo?" Oh, there's a gag that never gets old. To date, I suspect I have heard 7,392 Shakespeare references and pickup lines, and they're wrong every single time. If you will indulge the writer in me for just a moment, I promise I'll be brief. But wherefore does not mean where. It means why. So when in the story Juliette is saying, "Wherefore art thou Romeo?" she's asking why. Why are you Romeo, the man that I am not allowed to love? Still, I totally got his point, despite being 100% unoriginal. I went up to the stage, and it is there that I am introduced to the closer, the very drummer whom I had been warned about, and who is currently offering to be my Romeo for the night. There's a romantic codicil, which is exactly what I said to him, hoping that my sarcasm would impress upon him just how distasteful his comment was. Sadly, he responded by asking me, "What's a codicil?" Really, dude? I was tempted to tell him that a codicil was exactly the reason why he didn't get a per diem on this tour, but I kept my mouth shut. You see, I needed this article to go well. I needed the recognition it would give me as a writer, and I desperately needed that paycheck. Sleazy musicians were, at the time, considered something of a hazard of the job I had signed up for. Kind of like how an electrician understands that being electrocuted is a very real possibility on the job. Mind you, I don't say this to excuse the closer's behavior. I only offer it as an example of why I never considered it an option to, say, knee the guy in the balls the way I would today. Which meant I was in for 3 days of relentless pursuit. Everyone else on the tour was respectful and pleasant, but the closer treated me like a sail he needed to land. For example, later that night after the show, he handed me his hotel room key and said, "Don't take this the wrong way." Oh, all right. Because there's a right way to take it. I promptly tossed that key into the nearest porta potty and hoped that would be the end of it. And I really should have known better. The next morning, the closer attempted to ditch the tour bus and hitch a ride with me to Milwaukee under the guise of knowing me better. His attentions were so insistent that I started ducking into random rooms to avoid him. It was like some sort of perverse cartoon chase. And although this was great for dodging him, it wasn't so great in the things that I found behind those closed doors. In doing it, I had managed to unwittingly interrupt the tour manager in some fierce haggling over contracts. I accidentally interrupted a venue employee who was using the copy machine to duplicate his screenplay. And then, I barged in on the female singer just as she was pulling down her pants to pee. Sure, it was her fault for not locking the door, but I'll tell you, to this day, I still feel a little bad about that. So by the time we hit Chicago, I was done. I had barely spent 3 days on the road, and I already knew that touring was an endless train of boredom punctuated by brief stints of elation. Each night, as I stood out on the stage, watching the band, I would see thousands of people waving lighters in the air and singing along with every song. The magic of music was not lost on me, and it still isn't. It's just everything else that goes along with the life that I was only just starting to question. And that is exactly what I was doing when I bumped into the closer outside the band's venue that night. While I had been having lunch, alone, mind you, at the fast food place across the street, he had apparently been doing laps around the venue looking for me. I just laid it out for him. I said, "Look, I'm leaving after your show tonight. How about you just lay off? I'm not interested." And his winning response was, "But what fun would that be?" I roll my eyes as we walk up to the main backstage gate and silently pray that somebody will hit him in the head with an errant lighting rig. I whip out my pass and I'm able to sail right past the guard at the door. But it seems that the closer has forgotten his backstage pass. "Dude, I'm the drummer of the band," he says to the guard, who just laughs as if he has heard this one a million times. And let's face it, he likely had. The closer starts getting more and more agitated. He's insisting that people are waiting for him at soundcheck and that he'll have this guy fired if he doesn't let him in. And that guard did not budge. They never do. It doesn't matter who you are. So the closer looks at me for help, and I just kind of shrug my shoulders and walk away. And as I do, he is naming every single person backstage that he can possibly think of to verify him. And that unwavering, wonderful, awesome guy of a guard had 4 little words for him. Y'all, hearing "not on the list" has never sounded so goddamn good. And with that, I'm going to have some more bourbon. Hang on, y'all. Oh, bourbon. Well, before I wrap things up, I just want to remind you all that Kindred Homecomings, the new comic book series that I am in, is available now. And I want to thank all of y'all for supporting me with this project, particularly Ray from Naked Porch Podcast. Indie comics are a labor of love. So when Snug Comics asked me to be a part of this comic book, I was really excited to do it. And Kindred Homecomings is super cool. Me and actress Jamie Bernadette go on a monster hunt inspired by the 80s movie The Kindred. So if you want to check it out, you can get a digital copy or a print copy over at snugcomics.com. And now I'm going to head on outside, have myself a little bit of bourbon, and soak up some sunshine. Hope y'all have a great week. I'll chat with you again next. Cheers, y'all.
Go to theunwritablерant.com and sign up to get early access to interviews and new videos. You can hear new episodes of The Unwritable Rant on radiovegas.rocks every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern and on IPMNation.com on Saturdays and Sundays at 6 p.m. Eastern, and hear best of episodes every weekday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget to connect with Juliette on Twitter at Morning Neurosis.
Girl, you was pretty as a Sunday morning, standing on the corner at Carondelet. What you say we make our way up to Bourbon, couple hurricanes and a hand grenade, and get blown away. Let the chips fall where they may. If it's all the same, what you say, bon ton, hey, pretty mama, I can smell the gumbo. Sweetest taste of honeysuckle on my lips. Good God Almighty, I can hear the trombone. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this. Come a little closer, honey, let me hold you. Nothing tastes better than a bourbon kiss. You can be the flower on my magnolia. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this.